Hello, this is Professor Brown-Cedarberg, and I'd like to talk about getters and setters. We recall that classes have instance variables. Instance variables are attributes of the class, storage space into which values are stored. Those values are specific to the instance of that class. Now, instance variables can be private or public. The difference between a private and a public instance variable is that a public instance variable can be accessed from outside the class in which it resides. A private instance variable cannot. Good programming practice demands that all instance variables be private, therefore not accessible from outside the class in which they reside. This presents us with a bit of a challenge, because while good programming practice requires that all instance variables be private and therefore not accessible from outside the class in which they reside, there are times at which we would like to grant access from outside the class, but not in a carte blanche manner. We want to limit that access. And the way we accomplish that is through accessor methods. We're going to talk about them in just one moment. We're first going to look at this class, employee. You notice that it has two private instance variables, one of type string, name, one of type double, salary. Now, what we're going to develop are accessor methods. That's the formal name for a getter method. And a getter method returns back a value stored in the instance variable space specific to the instance that called that method. Now, by convention, we name getter methods get and then whatever they're getting. Getter methods do not expect arguments to be passed into them. Getter methods are always called by an instance of the class in which they reside. They return back a variable, the value stored in an instance variable space. They are always public, thereby accessible from the outside the class in which they reside. If they're private, they are of no use. They're always public. And they allow us to control access to a variable. So here we have our class employee with the same two instance variables, but now we have two getter methods, getName and getSalary. Notice that they're both public. They both return back the same type as the instance variable that they return, string for getName, double for getSalary. They both have a return statement, and they're returning back, in the case of getName, name, in the case of getSalary, salary, one specific instance variable. Remember, a method can only return one thing at a time. Notice that both of these methods are non-static, so they must be called by an instance of this class. Now, I haven't fully developed the methods. What we would do inside the body would be to have code that would limit access. For example, in the case of getSalary, you might have to enter in a password in order to be granted access to get the salary of a specific employee. So those are two getter methods. The flip side of getter methods are mutator methods. That's the formal name of what we'll call a setter method, what's called setter methods. And setter methods set a value. And they're always by convention named set and then whatever they're setting. They expect an argument to be passed, right? And they are always called by an instance of the class in which they reside. And that makes sense because they're setting a value for a specific instance. They're always public, same reasoning that we had with getter methods. And they always control access to change the variable. They control that change. So here's our class employee with two setter methods, setName and setSalary. Notice that both of these methods are public. Both are void. They're not returning anything back. They're setName and setSalary following our convention. And both expect a value to be passed in. In setName, we expect a string. In setSalary, a double. And within each one of these methods, the value passed in is stored into the instance variable space. Now again, these two methods have not been fully developed. Had they been fully developed, they'd have code that would validate the input before it was saved in the storage space. So in setSalary, we would validate the amount so that it could perhaps not be a negative number or not be greater than $1 million, what have you. Each one of these would have code that would validate that value that's input, that's passed into it before the value was saved. So those are two setter methods. Now, in conclusion, we've looked at instance variables, and we know that instance variables are attributes of the class. Their storage space, they can be private or public, but we should always make them private. We've looked at getter methods. They get a value, return it back. They're always public. And with getters, we want to control access to that variable. Setter methods always set a value. We set the value of an instance variable. They're always public. We always control the access to the change of that variable through validation, etc. You should always include getters and setters in your classes. Have getters, a getter for each and every instance variable. Have a setter for each and every instance variable. Now, getters we know return back a value, and so a getter can only return one value back at a time. And so you'll have a getter for each and every instance variable. Setters, though, can accept more than one argument. So you might have a different number of setters than you have instance variables. You might have a lesser number of setter methods than you have instance variables. Getter methods, it should always be a one-to-one. Setter methods, it might be a little bit different. But you should always have getters and setters in all of your classes. Thank you very much.